I am the lesser of the two gentlemen here in this stream. Ben is always better looking than I, and he's always, I don't know, he's just better in every way. He's British, so that makes him better than us dumb Americans. So, Ben, thanks for joining us. Hopefully, you had a great week. Everybody joining us, we're going to start our journey today on going through measurement data. And today we're going to talk about and focus really on frequency response. And then we're just going to move through some different things, kind of follow how a spinorama is laid out. We'll talk about some things that are not part of a typical spinorama data. Um, but yeah, we're going to jump straight into this because I think we got a lot to cover. Ben has prepared quite a few example images, which I'm always appreciative of because
I
he is
prepared
always
again.
much more prepared than I am. I like to fly by the seat of my pants, which is why I like these live sessions better instead of trying to prepare like a video on demand. My brain does not function very well with that. But Ben seems to function a little better with that, and he comes prepared. So we're going to jump into this.
I don't like to be underprepared, but I also hate to edit. So
It's funny how you said, "Yeah, I'm not going to be prepared for any of these videos," and then every video we've done, Ben is ready to go. he's just ready. So jumping straight into this, we got some images to share.
yeah, I guess we should talk first about what these graphs are going to show,
Yes,
why
that's a
they're
good
important.
place to start.
So we're going to start. That first one you're about to pull up is going to be a speaker's direct on-axis response, which is only a small proportion of what we actually hear in a room. You know, if we were stood in a field and this speaker was elevated a few meters off the floor and there was nowhere for reflections to come back, if that speaker's pointed straight at you, this is what you're going to hear with nothing else to come back at you. But
if you have not watched our video already on should you absorb or reflect first reflections, that may be a good place to start for this because it's going to give you a better understanding of exactly what Ben was just talking about. A lot of what we hear is reflections in daily life. I mean, we're hearing reflections all the time that's giving us a sense of the space, distances, all kinds of different things. And so on axis, what you're about to see here, though it is a very important measurement, it is by no means the end all be all to trying to determine how a speaker is going to behave in a space, unless you are anechoic.
Right. And, you know, we have a slight difference from how far you're sat from a speaker. So we would typically say that there's a transition point. There's two of them, right? From when all of the sound power, so that's all the sound, we're going to cover this properly in some detail in a minute, but where the omnidirectional sound that hits all the walls is the predominant thing you hear, where the room and the speaker combined are the predominant thing you hear, and that's the majority of sound. That's going to be like 100 hertz to 5K maybe, is going to be a combination of speaker and room. As we get really high frequency, the reflections are going to be lesser because dispersion characteristics of the speaker will be narrower. So at the very high end, you'll hear more of the speaker. At the very low end, you'll hear more of the room. And in between, you hear a combination of the two. So it's really easy for us to talk about this direct sound and how important it is. But in a room, you can't hear it. You're never going to hear this in isolation. We always have reflections. We're not going to avoid them. We've talked before about how you don't want to remove them entirely. You don't want to get rid of all of them. So this is not going to be what you actually hear audibly when you're sat in your seat.
But it is important to know.
Absolutely.
It is important to know so that you understand how the speaker behaves. And again, we're going to start with frequency response. We're going to talk a little bit today about CEA 2034 because it relates part of it is response. And then other episodes we're going to talk about down the line. We're going to do these in order. Not that you're going to think that the measurements aren't in any particular order, but we're going to go through a bunch of measurement episodes. All right. You go with me bringing this up?
Yeah.
All right. We're going to jump into this. This is we're not going to name any speakers. We're not here to shame anybody. though sometimes I wish we would, but that's not our place in this. Our place in this is purely educational
Right.
so that you guys can go out and determine what makes the most sense and then shame people with your wallet, right? And that's a quick shout out to what you're trying to do or what we're trying to do with CEDIA, um, with putting pressure on manufacturers to provide more of this data because a lot of manufacturers do not provide this data. And without measurement information, I argue, and I think Ben would agree, how can you make informed decisions on picking the correct tool for your room? It's not possible.
Yeah, I think, so this work effort with CEDIA will be called RP1. So it's a recommended practice for performance data.
Hmm.
And these are facts. It's actually called performance facts, right? This is not an opinion. Everything that will make it into a performance facts document is a fact. It's an objective fact. So there's no, it's really important that when we start to say, this speaker does this speaker does that, that they're objective and we've taken all opinion out of it. So I'm not going to say what is good and bad. There is a huge amount of work that's been done on that. That leads on from the work Floyd Toole did to create this standard in the first place, that Sean Olive did some really great work on understanding preference. And we're going to cover those in a minute. We'll get to how we can be pretty certain, because the academic research is there, that when a speaker behaves well across all of these measurements, the average listener will perceive it to sound good.
Hmm.
So it's really important that this is not just our opinion. And that's why we don't want to beat up, on these videos. I think we've removed the name of every single one. If there is one we haven't, then let's apologize in advance. But I believe they've all been removed. So this is about understanding how to use and read the data. And then we can talk in another episode about how we know for a fact that this data is going to relate to preference. We'll go in more detail on that. But this is not just our opinion, right? That's really key.
It's not an opinion. I would argue that this is not an opinion. I mean,
We're
there's
beyond
enough,
opinions at this
yeah,
stage.
there's enough research done on this that, I mean, you could call it a theory. We could call it a scientific theory because I think anybody that does a lot of experiments and stuff would say that, I don't know that it's always a theory, right? Even if it's true, it's still a theory. So this is, I think we're beyond opinion though.
Right. So this graph, the first one we're looking at, this is the direct sound. So when these measurements are taken, there are 72 measurements taken at different locations. And it will be 72 in an anechoic chamber. So if you're in a perfectly quiet, non-reflective, non-echoing room, I think we've probably all seen anechoic chambers with huge amounts of absorption and stuff around them.
Mhm.
You can do this in 72 measurements. If you don't have an anechoic chamber, there's a long process. It's way more measurements. You then do loads of clever, complex maths to get the result you would have got from a 72 if it was anechoic. So this one is effectively straight ahead. The paper says that any normal speaker, so any box type speaker we're used to seeing, should be stood in the room so that the bottom of it is horizontal to the floor. So this is positioned as if it was just sat normally in your room, how you would use it. And this measurement is taken straight ahead on the reference axis. And that should be given by the manufacturer. Many times you can work it out. If its speaker is symmetrical about its center point, you'll know roughly where it is. But when it's, a tweeter at the top, a mid-range, some woofers, you may not know exactly where the acoustic center of that speaker is. So the manufacturer should be able to tell you where the acoustic reference is. And this measurement is taken on that reference line. So What do you think of that one, Ryan? Is it any good?
I'm not going to
Hello?
pass judgment. No, I'm
Oh,
here. I'm not going to pass judgment. But before I think we get into defining if something's good or not, I think it's important, and maybe this is where you're going to go, to talk about the scales.
right. So the way this data is laid out is defined very specifically. So you can't publish this data with a different scale to this. That scale is very specific. You'll notice that we're going up. There's a ratio. So the width, the height of the way this is done, it's defined by. I'm going to have to confirm in my notes that I actually know what the paper is because I'm going to get it wrong. I probably didn't write it down. That's good. It is an IEC 20263, I think, is the correct
I can't believe you remember
method.
that.
I don't know. I got it right, but there is a specific way. You'll see that this is very fine resolution. So each of those small lines is 1 dB. It fluctuates around, sure, but not by a lot. That speaker is pretty flat.
Pretty flat. It's
Absolutely.
pretty good.
So even if we were going to try and pass judgment, we can't from that because, as we've already said, we're not going to hear that in a room. So from that alone, it would be completely ridiculous to attempt to determine how that speaker will sound in any given room. We know what it sounds directly in front, and if we're particularly near field to it, we're going to get more and more of this. So if you were sat under a meter away from this, that's much closer to what you'll hear. But the reality is that in most of our listening rooms, we're sat 2 meters plus. So by 3 meters, the room is really significantly playing a part. So what's that, 10, 12 feet?
Yep.
If you're 10, 12 feet, which would be average in most domestic living rooms, that it's just not possible. Through that kind of 100 to 5K range, that's not what you're going to hear because the room is going to have so much impact.
Now, it's not what you're going to hear, but it is important to note that looking at this does tell you a lot about how the speaker is behaving.
Right. If we will look at some later that are less flat than this. That to me looks, what I'm most interested in is that it's quite smooth. There's nothing major that jumps out and there's no big anomalies. Okay, there's a little bump happening between 1,000 and 2,000, but at this point, I'm not concerned. It's 2 dB. There's actually some interesting reasons why that may actually be beneficial when we see some of the others. That's not
now when you're talking about between 1,000 and 2,000, I think that's a good segue into, can you shed some light on what the vertical lines mean and why they're scaled in the way they're scaled?
Yes. So they are going, that's logarithmic. So the vertical lines are frequency. So we are starting at 20 hertz to the far left and 20,000 hertz to the far right. So low frequency bass is on the left-hand side, really high frequency treble is on the right-hand side.
So your crossover point is usually, let me see if my mouse shows up, it does. So your crossover point usually is somewhere in this vicinity.
Yeah, to bass management, if you're handing over to a subwoofer, you're going to be down there.
Now remember, and this is a caveat that a lot of people get themselves into, is that they're like, oh, well, the speaker just needs to be flat or behave down to whatever, 80 hertz in order to have a good crossover. You actually want to look significantly past that in order to make sure, because remember, a crossover, if you're doing like your typical one on an AVR is an LR24. So you're 24 dB per octave. So you're going to lose 24 dB per octave, but the speaker's still going to be playing. So you still want it to be behaved below where the actual crossover is taking place. So you're going to want to look further down, even though you would say, oh, my subs are handling that. And then for subs, it's the opposite. You want to look further up to make sure that the behavior is consistent, because it will screw up your crossover. it will screw up that transition zone. Sorry, just wanted to throw that out there while we were moving up the frequency range.
Yeah, absolutely. So this speaker certainly appears to play very low frequency. It's got a lot of output.
We could assume it's
Lo-
full range.
Right. That's a speaker that for music probably, don't need a sub in most rooms. That probably is not going to need a subwoofer. There is a lot of output down to at least 30 hertz. It falls off a cliff at 30,
With
as
the
we'd expect.
standard, because you did say there was a standard with this, what does 0 represent in that standard?
So 0 would be normalized. There's some initial tests you run initially to get a level. So if you imagine playing a sound that was the same volume at all frequencies, it would run along that 0 line. So that is a referenced point, and everything above that line is perceivably louder, and everything below it is perceivably quieter than that reference level.
Is there a reference SPL that is used for these measurements?
That is essentially found per speaker. It is found from applying 2.83 volts. So the speaker's efficiency, its sensitivity will change what that particular SPL is, but it's relevant to that particular speaker.
Okay. So 0, if I'm understanding this correctly for the audience, is the sensitivity of the speaker. If what it gets with 2.83 volts at X distance, which is typically
essentially it's kind of its average sensitivity. So if that is a speaker which is rated at 89 dB at 2.83 volts, that line basically represents that. Some of it's a bit above, some's a bit below. It's average. That is essentially the sensitivity of a speaker at 0.
Okay. I ask, so just so people know, I ask a lot of these questions I put myself in a position of what the audience may be asking, just so people are aware. Okay, carrying on. And I don't think we continued on the logarithmic scale. I kind of cut you off with the crossover point. So let's jump back to explaining the logarithmic scale as we move up with what the bottom axis represents.
Yeah, so we look at frequencies logarithmically because we perceive the amount of energy per band, and as we go up in frequency, a wider band effectively gives us similar perceived energy as we listen to it. So what we're doing here, those lines from 20 to 30 is a huge gap, from 30 to 40 smaller, getting way up. Now we're looking at small increments from 100. Again, from 100 to 200 looks huge, but then it goes down 300, 400 to 1,000. So the gap from 200 to 1,000 is quite similar, actually, from 20 to 100. But actually, it's now covering 10 times as big a range. Then the same happens again. If you look at from 2,000 to 10,000, it's a similar size part of this graph. So if we just looked at this in a linear way, so that if every frequency increase was the same size going horizontally, it wouldn't really tell us much about how we really perceive that. This is much more valid of what we really kind of hear and the way the energy in those frequency bands is actually played to us. So it's easy to assume that dead flat here would be exactly what you want, but it's more complicated than saying that perfectly flat here would be the best speaker, because so much of what we hear comes from its off-axis response that you could have a speaker that, hypothetically, that was perfectly flat here, but did crazy things as soon as you go a few degrees off, and that speaker still won't sound great. So this is really, really important. It tells you a lot about the characteristics of a speaker, but it's not the only thing that's important by a long, long way.
Okay.
So the next line, if you can find it labeled, in fact, yeah, you can click on what's called early reflections. So this is now showing us, and it's slightly covered up by your name on my screen. I don't know if that is everywhere, might not be.
Floor bounce is the bottom left one.
Perfect. Okay, so we have floor bounce, ceiling bounce, front wall, side wall, rear wall, and total early reflections. So actually, I'm going to send you another image actually to bring up, because it's actually going to help understand where all these measurements come from. So let me send that to you. If I've got it, I might not. I was going to explain where these come from, so I will find that while I'm talking and make sure you have it. As I said, there's 72 measurements taken. And what these ones comprise, so early reflections, the floor bounce is 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and 40 degrees below that reference line. So the first one we looked at, the on-axis, everything that's in floor bounce, which is the red line, it is red. It's the purpley one. It's got your name written over it.
Yeah.
That is
It's this one. Yeah, it's this one.
It's the
This purple
sum
line.
of the averaged of 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and 40 degrees below that reference line, the one we just looked at.
And actually, it's not going up. It's this one.
Yeah, that one. That's the one.
Yep.
So ceiling bounce is in the positive side. So we're now above that reference line. And we're looking at 40 degrees, 50 degrees, and 60 degrees. So they're a bit different from floor bounce. The likelihood is in most rooms that the speaker is going to be below halfway up the room and you're less than halfway up the room, you're seated ear height. So actually the angle of sound which hits the ceiling and comes back to you is going to be a bit more acute than off the floor, just because of the geometry of the room.
Mm-hmm.
And these have been found and confirmed in testing, sort of Harman's researchers, Floyd and Sean Olive, have measured lots of listening rooms to calculate which actual bits of these reflections are most likely to be relevant in a typical listening room. So yeah, you've got 3 measurements down, 3 measurements up for floor and ceiling. And then the front wall bounce is 10, 20. It's plus minus 10, plus minus 30, plus minus 10, 20, and 30. So you have got in that one 7 measurements: 0, plus minus 10, plus minus 20, plus minus 30, horizontal. Is your front wall bounce. Your side wall is plus minus 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80 horizontal. It's all the energy coming out the side. So essentially everything which isn't directly coming at you, everything that's going to hit the side walls, goes into that one. And the rear wall is actually everything that's going behind the speaker. If this is a standard bookshelf, stand mount, a stand mount, a floor stand, the rear wall is everything that's going backwards. It's massively lower here, as you'd expect. That's behind the speaker. But it's really important. There is still energy going behind the speaker. And as we go lower in frequency and this gets omnidirectional, there's a lot of energy going back. Once we're down to 100 hertz, there's as much energy going backwards that hits the screen wall as there is going forwards. We're going to be rolling this off in a cinema use if we're putting a sub in to probably 80 hertz. But if you're using this for 2-channel stereo with no sub, you've got to remember that below 100 hertz, there is as much, or in fact, more energy going backwards than forwards.
An important thing to consider here, especially if this measurement is being made, if you have this measurement, is how you place this in a room is going to affect how it correlates to this measurement. So when we're talking about sound going backwards, something that can change this and that you need to be cognizant about is ports. So if I have a tower speaker, or even a bookshelf, and let's say I have a bookshelf, because this is actually a great example of this. Um, Sometimes, depending on your need to mount things, it can be beneficial to put a bookshelf on a wall. A lot of bookshelves have rear firing ports, and those bookshelves are not necessarily designed to be placed near boundaries. And so you can affect how what's happening in your room correlates to this measurement. So you have to make sure that if you're trying to understand how a speaker is going to behave in your room, that you correlate how you're using it in your room to make sure that you understand how things can change. Because if you put a port next to a boundary, it can vastly change how you're going to perceive things because of boundary interaction, for things like wall bounce. Um, just to give you another caveat.
Yep. And we haven't discussed on this channel, you and I haven't discussed SBIR, or speaker boundary.
No, we need to. We will
Exactly that, right?
eventually.
So we will talk about the interference that is caused by these reflections, but you have to remember that the energy that's going back will hit that screen wall and is now going to reflect off it back towards the speaker, where at certain frequencies it's going to cancel out.
Mhm.
So there is some interesting play between the distance you bring it, how that behaves, if it's ported. I have just sent you, Ryan, if you can pull it up, the list of where all these measurements are taken. It's going to be much easier for us to show these if you're able to bring the one in I've just sent you. But we can note some things, right, until you find that and pull that up. So in our, which one's okay? You've got it now.
I've already got it.
Right.
Fast.
So it says here that there's 70 microphone positions. The reason I say 72 is it's 72 measurements. 2 of the positions are duplicated. So the perfectly on axis at the front is taken as both a vertical and a horizontal measurement, and so is the 180 at the back. So as these spins are taken, it's 72 measurements. 2 of them get duplicated for 70 positions. But we now can see here that's all the positions where this is taken. So it's quite important that on-axis line is correct. You don't want to be getting that wrong, which is why it's really useful for manufacturers to tell us where their reference line is. We will cover what happens with a line speaker or a line array later, because it
is different.
Complex how useful this would be for all speaker types. So we are focused on this being a point source loudspeaker for certain here. And there's 2 ways you can take these measurements. You could either be moving the microphone, or you can be moving the speaker. It's pretty standard that if you're doing this in an anechoic chamber, sort of somewhat by hand, you're going to move the speaker. It'll be on a rotating table. If you're not doing it in an anechoic chamber, you're probably using a tool like a clip-all near-field scanner, and that's going to move the microphone. It takes way more measurements than these, because it does a lot of maths to get rid of the effects of reflections. But that's when we talk about 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, these are the positions where those are taken. So if you pull up a full 2034, there is one important line between what all of these are. So all of those ones we just looked at, the floor bounce, ceiling bounce, front wall bounce, side wall, rear wall bounce, they are all summed together to be called early reflections. So early reflections are essentially every reflection that's going to reach you with one bounce. That's the key of why those are the angles chosen. These are intended to be one bounce from ceiling, floor, both side walls, and the front and back wall of the room. So the one we haven't discussed is in between, is the listening window. So to me, the listening window is more important overall than the direct sound. So it's the yellow one here. And the listening window is, to me, that's everything. If I've pointed this speaker in the right place in the room, all of my seats should fall within the listening window. So I'm going to intentionally keep the seats in that range. And the range is plus minus 10 degrees vertical, and then it's plus minus 10, 20, and 30 degrees horizontal. So we've got up to 30 degrees either side, up to 10 degrees above and below. If I screen share, I'm going to show you a visualization of that. If I can pull the right window up. Window. Here we go. So this is the same model we looked at when we talked about first reflections. If you're able to, will that show on my screen, on your screen? You might need to take yours down. There we go. Oh, there it is. Right. Let me pull this up so I can see it. So the blue, I'm going to zoom back out. This was a room we used to talk about was it last week before?
Yeah.
I've now angled this speaker towards my seats. The small blue section is basically my on-axis. That is, in this diagram, it's 1 degree above and below and 1 degree left and right, just so it's visible. But essentially, that is the direct radiating sound. Everything in that green region is my listening window.
Yep.
So that goes up to 30 degrees left and right, and it goes 10 degrees above and below. If I move around behind the speaker, as if by magic, look at that. All of my seats in this room are going to fall in that range. And when we come across the top of the room, inside that range, where that speaker's positioned, none of it's hitting the floor, the ceiling, or the walls. So that is sound that you're going to hear directly from the speaker. It's going to cover the whole of your listening area, hopefully. That's, a big chunk of a sound that is actually getting to you. Like, if you move your head a few inches, you can't possibly be on the blue line. Both your ears can't be on it at the same time anywhere. It's impossible. So what you hear, if the speaker's correctly positioned, is all coming from that green area.
And I would argue, and actually you don't even need to argue, that being on axis on several different types of speakers is actually detrimental.
Yeah, there are certain things that can cause some speakers to not behave perfectly on axis.
And that doesn't mean that they're bad
have
speakers.
some
Right.
effect, but any speaker which is got symmetry can have there is some interplay that can occur directly on axis, which even 2-3 degrees off doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't have both your ears perfectly on that axis line anyway. So that's why I say it tells a lot about what the speaker does, but it's not the only or most, it's not the only thing that's important here. It's, to me, I'm really interested in that listening window and how that looks.
Right.
So if I stop my share and we go back to our 2034, on this particular speaker, our listening window yellow is very similar to our direct sound, which is great. There's not any huge big deviations. The orange section here essentially comes from the work that was done by Floyd and Sean Olive, which is giving a range of where preference is likely to be. So people generally like sound which falls within those areas. So we're looking for the yellowy orange line to fall within that yellowy orange space. This speaker does a really good job of that. It's likely to have a high preference score. But the thing that...
And high preference score meaning people will like it.
Correct. When you put it in a room and let people listen to it, it's likely that people would like this speaker. So there's some interesting things we can see there, right? So if you look at how closely the direct and listening window track up to about 1,000 hertz, they start to deviate after that from 1,000 to 2,000 hertz. So right where you are now, kind of that big open section here, there's some deviation there. I can tell almost certainly that there's a crossover in this speaker.
And you're saying
starts that
deviation,
range.
mainly the response stays consistent, how it reacts at each particular frequency, but the power or SPL is different.
So I know, and I didn't tell you this to start with, but I know that this set of measurements has been EQ'd to try and get it to where it would display the highest preference score. So they've actually added a boost in to the direct sound through that range. So, they've used an EQ to try and bring the listening window flatter. That's not quite its natural response. But what's really happening here is the directivity is changing as we're going through the crossover. We're moving into the tweeter. It's now a smaller dome. It's got a broader dispersion characteristics there. So there's just a change happening. It's been EQ'd here. It's not a problem to me. Where are we at there? Like 1 dB, 2 dB's difference.
And
Where I would be
given the width of this, it was probably a lower Q filter that was applied.
Right.
And I don't have an issue with that.
I could find that exact filter because I do know what it is. It was listed where I took this from. But no, they've EQ'd it to get the best in-room preference score it could achieve. It's minor. You can tell it's minor because the behavior is still really close. Like, they've not had to do anything wild because the direct is completely different to the reflected sound. There is a drop in the reflected sound. You can see in the red line and the green line. Through that region, actually the level of reflected sound drops a bit. So what they've done here is they've EQ'd up the direct a little bit to try and counter the fact there's a little bit less energy in the reflections. I'm perfectly happy with what they've done here. But the key for me is that they're tracking really nicely. So when you apply that EQ to a direct sound, you know what's happening to your reflected sound too, because they're basically the same. Of course, there is a lowering of power as we get wider and wider reflections, but the behavior is the same. If you find one of the other ones, let's talk about that. So pull up, I think you've got like your fourth one down or something like that, maybe. In fact, any of the top 4 you've got in that list. Okay. That's a bit different to look at. So here, actually, direct and reflected are still tracking each other quite nicely. But in terms of EQing, so this hasn't been EQ'd. That one we just looked at was the only one that had been EQ'd, as far as I'm aware. What you're going to see now is at, where are we at? 200, 300, 400, 5, about 700, between 5 and 700 hertz. There is different behavior in that listening window to the early reflections. So the reflections that are going off to the sidewalls, going up to floor and ceiling, the average and the sum of those is different to what's in the listening window. So if that was my loudspeaker, natural theory would be, well, I want the direct sound to be flatter than this. You might EQ a bit of a boost in that range. Then you've got a problem because the reflections didn't drop in the same as the direct sound did. So as soon as you EQ the direct sound flat, you're now going to have too much energy in those reflections. And that might be, as we talked about in reflections, a point where You could counter that by trying to absorb some of it. You might end up with the speaker putting a bit of a boost in there with EQ to bring the direct up, and then you have to use the room to try to bring the reflections down. It would be more preferential to not have those be different, so that they're tracking with a really similar shape. What we do to one is also beneficial to the other.
So what he's talking about, just to bring this in, just to make sure, reiterate here, is you have your early reflections. There's somewhat of a dip here. And when he's saying they EQ'd, so you have a dip versus this little rise. So this was probably flatter. So they were able to bring this up, and this tracked consistently up. It didn't
Yeah.
create a issue by bringing too much energy into the room, because they were following more consistently.
And if we look on this one around 300 hertz, you'll see you've got that little dip. So if I wanted to EQ that, let's just say I was trying to make this really flat. This speaker's pretty flat to start with, so it doesn't need wild amounts of EQ. But let's just say I wanted to EQ out that small dip there. When I do that, it would also flatten the response of my red line and my green line. So the reflections would benefit in the same way as the direct sound would. If we've got these lines going in different directions, so if they're diverging, the yellow and blue lines are going up above zero and the red line is dropping down, they're going in completely opposite directions. Anything you do to EQ out one makes the other worse.
Yeah.
That's problematic. Here, if you look every little dip up and down, there's going to be some cabinet resonances here. Quite likely that some of these notches and dips are essentially cabinet resonances, because they are not specific to the direct sound. They're not only in that listening window, but they follow the same shape, including all the reflections and the broader reflections, which is sound power. So that's now all of our reflections. When that same energy is seen in all directions, well, it's radiating from a cabinet everywhere. It's not being measured direct. So if that's a small cabinet, an effect of some cabinet resonance there, well, when we EQ it, it improves everywhere. That's ideal. Really good. Maybe not the case in some of the others. Let's try to find one that's a bit less flat. I think you may have one that is a horizontal center speaker somewhere. There we go. So this one now is slightly different. Instead of the summed averages, we're actually now just looking at horizontal 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 degrees. So as a horizontal center channel, that is what is coming out to that across your seats. So
not great.
Well, it's problematic.
You're trying to be too kind to it.
Yeah. I'm trying to be kind. It's problematic. To start with, we've got this dip in the direct sound between 1,000 and 2,000.
Yep, this one. So your direct on axis is green, I believe.
It will be the dark bluey type color, I think.
Is it?
It'll be the top one here, that one that you just on.
Yeah,
yep.
It's this one.
That's direct. So there is a dip there that is a few dB. So let's say we EQ out that. That's going to bring up the level of all of our reflections. So every one of those reflections is going to come up in level as you start to level that out. But you don't want to be raising through that section anywhere, let's say from 300 to 1,000. It doesn't need to be boosted. So you're not going to be putting any boost at all in there, right? That's
Mhm.
not going to get raised up. So because of the directivity we've got, by the further you're sat away from that reference seat, the further left and right, the less energy you're going to hear. If you're 60 degrees off, 60 degrees is a long way, but you could easily be sat 40 degrees off here. And then we're talking 5 dB down through that whole range, or certainly through 5, 6, 7,000 hertz.
I think the easiest way to put this is that there is no seat, there is no off-axis position or on-axis position in which anything is consistent.
Right.
Because if you sit in, say, like, if you look at, uh, light blue, which I think is 30 degrees, so
Yeah.
this line right here, you may say in the lower frequency range before you get into bass, so you're talking 100 to 800 hertz, well, even up to well, no, it starts dropping. It's pretty flat. I mean, it's not perfect, but it is pretty flat. But
Yeah.
then it drops, and then it comes up significantly.
Yeah.
So, it's consistent here, but it's not consistent here. So, you
Right.
may sit in a position that is okay for one range, but it's messed up at another, and there's no consistency at any point in the speaker, on axis or off, which makes it nearly impossible, probably actually impossible, in order to create a uniform experience across any seating position. You can't even get it for one seating position because it'll be off at some other frequency
Yeah.
range.
And I'm not upset with that behavior up to 1,000 hertz, because it's just getting quieter. Ultimately,
Yeah,
it's not unpleasant, right? You're getting
it's not
further away from the reference
terrible.
seat. It's getting quieter.
Yes.
Okay, that's not the
It's
end of the world.
consistent up to that
Exactly
point,
that,
but then
right?
it diverges.
Yeah, and that's where this will be an MTM type speaker. I don't know if it's a two-way or three-way, but as we transition through that crossover, there's clearly a crossover somewhere in that region.
Yes.
The behavior now changes.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, and we're in a place now where I don't mind on this particular speaker. It wouldn't be the end of the world to me that as we're drifting off axis, it's getting quieter, if that's consistent. But once I EQ that speaker to take out this dip from 1200 to 2000, it's going to bring the red up another few dB.
Mhm.
Suddenly now we've got this big difference. Like, our on axis will be quite flat, our off axis is getting quieter, then it suddenly gets louder, then hey, all hell breaks loose, doesn't it, from there?
Well, and this
Weird.
doesn't even consider your early reflections. You're gonna screw all of that up once you start adjusting your other axis.
Right. So 40, 50, 60 we would be classing as reflections, so that's likely to be coming off the sidewall, so that's fine. They're tracking very similar to the direct sound. We talked in the reflections episode that when the reflections are tonally similar to the direct sound, they're not distracting. They can
Right.
bring positive benefit. They can actually broaden the sound stage. There's a lot of nice things happen when those early reflections are tonally similar to the direct sound. This one isn't going to do that in that 1,000 to 2,000 range.
No.
The direct sound and the reflected sound are starting to do different things.
I mean, frankly, it's not gonna do that at all above about 1,000 hertz.
No.
There's no consistency. They're drifting all over the place. They're not staying consistent with one another. Um, so up to 1,000 hertz, it's not bad. After that, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, it would be a challenge. And this is
You're too nice.
kind of standard of horizontal center channels, though. They are going to display some issues. There's many ways to do this, but none of them are perfect. To get horizontal dispersion from a horizontal center channel isn't an easy thing to do. So, we are aware that they are suboptimal.
Hmm.
It's the challenge. If you don't have a acoustic transparent projection screen, you probably don't have that option. That's what you're going to get, right?
They are
So
challenging, but they're a necessary evil in some capacities and in some
absolutely.
instances, mainly because of placement.
Yeah. So if we pull up now one of the ones which is a full CEA, there are 2 more lines at the bottom. Well, in fact, I haven't really talked sound power. So sound power,
Let's go back to the one we liked.
yeah. Okay, so sound power isn't as straightforward as you might think. So it is averaged across all of the readings. So you've got 70 measurements in there. But it scales, like it's imagining if we were looking at the whole sphere of sound, right? If you imagine this was a spherical radiation from a speaker going in all directions, it's looking at the power across the average of that sphere. So because some of these measurement points get further away from center, like they represent a bigger chunk of the sphere, the averaging is not as straightforward as just adding all of them up and dividing it. There is a slightly more complicated way of the way that magnitude's done. But essentially, the green line represents all of the energy that speaker's putting out. And per Sean Olive's kind of work here, if it falls in that green region, it's likely to be perceived.
And you're talking about this area here.
Correct. So if you stay within that region, that is essentially kind of what's happening in the room. That's all of the energy in total. If you stay within that green region, the likelihood is that speaker will be perceived to be pleasant to listen to. So, we said we wouldn't pass judgment, but this is not a bad speaker. Let's be honest.
No.
It's not doing anything wrong anywhere.
Nope.
It's actually a speaker I've never heard, so I don't know.
This would be fine.
Yeah. I've never heard it, so I don't actually know what my preference of it is, but I feel like I would be quite happy to try this out.
I'll put it this way. It's an objectively designed speaker.
It's been designed on purpose by somebody that knows what they're doing.
Yes. It's a scientifically derived in the science of sound loudspeaker. That's what this is. And it's following appropriately to what and how we understand sound to behave. And our perception.
Right. They've not landed here by accident.
No.
This is designed by somebody who understands that certain designs are preferable to listen to, and they have intentionally designed something which falls within those parameters. So the easy thing is for people to say, I don't like this or I don't like that. It's everybody wants to think that they've got self-judgment and that, their opinion is different. What they like might be different for everyone else. The reality is, actually, it's pretty standardized. Of course, there's preference. No one's claiming there's not. But the likelihood is that most people will like something which is quite similar.
There's a lot of subjective bias that gets into this where people believe and they want to create the bias because they want to be an anomaly.
Yeah, I think that definitely exists. It's really interesting on that kind of personal opinion of how much bass will be appreciated by different people. So Olive actually found in his research, and it was a small sample from a paper I was reading earlier, but more highly trained listeners were like less of a bass hump than an untrained listener. So everybody in his study liked a bass contour, but essentially the more trained you were, so people who've worked in audio or other engineers, people who were familiar with how sound should be, liked less of a rise than completely untrained listeners. And it's similar at the other end, but untrained listeners almost liked a bit more of a smiley face type shape, more bass, more treble, a bit kind of in your face, loads of bass. So there is some difference.
And
But
I
once
want to say that there's nothing wrong with that either way. You have your preference. We're not here to tell you that. I'm just trying to get out ahead of what people may think. We're not here to tell you that your listening habits or what you like or don't like is wrong, especially in your own space. This is just simply what the researchers have found during their testing when they were trying to figure out how listeners perceive and what they desire. So don't think that we're saying, hey, you're wrong for liking X, Y, or Z. That's not the case. We're simply saying that if you stay beholden to these use cases and these objectives and these theories, that more than likely you're going to have a positive experience.
right. And the amount of bass that was found in that study that was preferable was a lot. Let's be honest, it was a lot. It would require a lot of EQ. Like, no speakers kind of naturally do what the untrained listeners in that study wanted. We're talking like at 50 hertz plus maybe 14 dB up.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of bass. And I would say there are probably a lot of enthusiasts who that's exactly what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So his definition of trained versus untrained was, we could essentially say people who work in audio, audio engineers, if they're looking for something which is accurate to real life, that may not, it's perfectly reasonable to want entertainment. If you're watching a blockbuster movie, you want gunshots and bangs and explosions to be entertaining. We're not chasing reality all the time. So there is some subjectivity there, 100%. But the interesting thing, and where these orange and green regions come from, is when you do look at where their preference lies, and you look at a different on-axis measurements, it's quite interesting that they fall within each, like they naturally align.
Mm-hmm.
So if you get a speaker where the listening window, like the listening window line stays really nicely within that orange area, the likelihood is in a typical room that if that speaker's well designed, the in-room response is also going to be preferable. So we're not seeing here specifically an in-room response, and we will cover that in, I think, the next episode, how they've built from these lines to actually how they know what it's going to do in your room and what people like. But that's, at the moment, those orange and green bits are basically speaker falls within there. It's likely most people will like it.
Mm-hmm.
So the lines we haven't discussed are those two at the bottom.
Yep.
And the two at the bottom, we have got the early reflections directivity index and the sound power directivity index. So basically, the steeper that line is, the bigger the difference between the reflected sound and the direct sound. So if that line's going up really quite steep, it means that speaker has got a narrow dispersion. So we think, I don't have...
Which line are you talking about?
The green line at the bottom.
Okay.
Will be the early reflection directivity index. So that is the difference between the early reflections and the direct sound. It's effectively a, one minus the other. So the steeper that goes, the more difference there is from direct to early reflections, the average of early reflections.
And as you said, you would be able to assume that it's a narrow dispersion speaker.
Yeah, the flatter that, the lower that line stays, the narrower the dispersion, the natural dispersion of that speaker. So I don't have a black swan measurement in front of me to look at that, but a black swan measurement is going to be a shallower curve. That green line at the bottom is going to stay shallower because, hold on, opposite, it's going to get steeper.
Yeah, I was going to say it's steeper.
Other way around. So that will get steeper because
there is more of
it's
a
throwing
difference.
its energy very specifically towards you, not throwing it backwards. It's, you know, it's not radiating a lot. So the reflections that are going off to the sides will be minimal relative to the direct.
They will be less in power in comparison to the on-axis power.
Correct.
So your steeper line shows a correlation between the more substantial power of the on-axis versus the lesser power of off-axis.
Exactly that.
Steeper that line is, the greater the difference, which indicates a more narrow dispersion.
So if we had a true omnidirectional speaker, I'm thinking of some I've seen in the past. I've seen speakers which essentially hang. It's, you know, it's a waveguide that plays in 360 degrees.
The funky one that's usually shows up at shows that's really heavy and that it's omnidirectional. It has like a cone on the top of it. Chat's gonna know what I'm talking about. I just saw a picture of one at Expona.
Yeah, there's a few that do it in interesting ways. I think of an Italian brand called Knack Sound, who they're hanging like almost it's almost like a light fitting. It's a hanging fitting which goes into a full 360 degree waveguide. So if this was a true omnidirectional plays in 360 degrees, that green line would be flat because the sound going out the sides is exactly the same as the sound going out the front. There is, you know, if it's a round speaker playing omnidirectionally, there is no front, back, left, right.
Yep.
So the green line would now be
MBL.
flat.
Thank you, chat.
The MBLs, of course. Well, if you think the MBLs are funky, look up a brand called Knack Sound, NACsound.com. And yeah, they make really omnidirectional products. There is no difference in any way of what that speaker puts out in each direction. It is exactly the same in every direction you move from.
And again, because it is symmetrical, that line will be flatter.
Yeah. So then the gray line is the same, but with sound power. So that is now the difference between sound power and the direct. And you can see, you know, on this particular speaker, that little step that happens at 1,000 to 2,000 hertz.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's why in this particular case they've EQ'd it a little boost because there's less energy in the reflections. They've boosted that up a little bit. But they track very smoothly. They're not wild. I don't know if you've got any of the others that have got the directivity indexes on them. Okay, so that's, well, any of these are kind of, that's interesting. Go back. Where are we at? Where was the one that was just a bit, that one. So on this one, you'll see that around 2,000, just shy of 3,000 hertz, the sound power takes a big dip, more so than the early reflection directivity index. So something different is happening there.
Crossover.
Going backwards, going, you know, at really acute angles. That speaker is not sending out as much energy into those reflections as it is direct. Sorry, it's the other way around, right? So look at its direct energy. The direct energy drops down heavily, but the sound power doesn't drop. So the difference gets smaller. That's going to be a challenge to EQ because when we EQ the direct sound back close to flat, if we choose to, we're going to put energy into reflections that potentially we didn't want.
And you're looking at this where you've got the on-axis sound, which is here, which drops. And then you're looking at sound power, which is here, which is flat.
Yeah, the sound power's, you know, quite a nice shape, but it's not going to stay.
It's a nice shape, yes.
Yeah, at that point, yeah. Um, it will actually, once you EQ this, it will move the sound power back within the kind of preference range.
Yes.
Um, it will be a challenge how that then behaves at different seats. So this one is, it just essentially tells you that you might have to deal with it in the room more. You might need to be careful about how you EQ it. You might need to be careful about how you position it. It's it's not going to be as easy to get a great result from that as it was the first one we looked at. Because the first one's just really well behaved. It doesn't do anything wrong. You've not got a lot to fix. When you fix things, it doesn't make anything else worse. This one, less much.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Well, I'm intrigued at the moment because we've been live for what, an hour, and we have no questions come in. So that
There's
either we're
been
doing
a
a good
couple.
job or we're doing a terrible job.
There's been a couple.
Oh, has there? Oh, have I not
Yeah.
got the chat window open?
But I
Oh,
do want to put up
I didn't have the chat window open, so
some
I haven't
more
seen any of those.
caveats here. And that is that it is important to remember, and a lot of people get themselves into trouble with this one. It's important to remember that this does not mean this is how this speaker is going to behave at every frequency, or not frequency, SPL, especially as you near the speaker's limits. Things are going to compress. So do not expect that, especially on the low end, that this speaker is going to behave and have this level of extension as you increase the volume. I think a lot of people find themselves in that correlation that they're like, "Oh, this speaker is flat," and they put it at really high SPLs, and that's not
Yeah,
the experience that you're going to get. So this is only one part of the puzzle. The frequency response in CEA 2034 represent effectively at the speaker's sensitivity, so at 2.83 volts at 1 meter, how the speaker is behaving anechoically. This does not correlate or go into how the speaker is going to behave at all SPL. So again, one piece of the puzzle. It is very important to ensure that you use every piece of the puzzle and a sum of its parts instead of every part individually. And
right.
people have a tendency to look at every part individually instead of the sum. So again, and I'm going to continue to reiterate this, you got to look at everything together. You need to see all of the data. If a
Yeah,
manufacturer just puts out, "Hey, here's our frequency response," in a lot of ways, it's kind of worthless because you can't draw the other conclusions needed to really understand that even that frequency response at
right.
other SPLs. This is only one small part of
Yeah.
everything, though it is very helpful. And remember that people have a tendency to hyper focus on axis sound. And that, again, like I've said with everything else, is only one small part of the puzzle.
So it's fun, isn't it? When people focus on axis sound and look at, if people look at these graphs and they look and really hyper focus on the on axis line, but then they don't point the speakers at their seats. I mean, are you insane? It's like there's no point focusing on the on axis if you don't listen to the on axis.
Well, a
At
perfect
least,
example of this with I love the Black Swans, but if I listen to them smack on with the driver, they sound a little bit like this,
right.
right? They've got that horn kinda horniness, and I don't you're not gonna like it. So, you use the entire breadth of information to figure out, "Oh, I actually wanna sit a few degrees off axis." And that's
Yep.
okay. That doesn't mean that the speaker is bad, and this is just one example. It just means I've gotta use it within its limitations because in order that speaker was designed to fix certain problems. But in almost every case, that fix creates some other level of compromise that has to be either
Right.
dealt with or just lived with. So,
Yep.
gotta look at the sum of its parts.
And what you definitely know is when you look at a speaker like that and its data, is that you don't want to sit 50 degrees off axis.
No.
You know, I'm going to just very quickly share my screen again to show the model I made. So if I can now open the right window, we have this speaker and it's listening window and it's direct sound. If I turn on the left speaker, you know, look where it goes. If you point that speaker straight, well, the direct sound is nowhere near where any of the seats are. And, you know, it's presumed that everything in that green area is going direct to seats. It's not going to be reflected. But if we put that speaker straight, loads of that energy is now part of the first reflection. So this data is relying on the fact, you know, it gives us the information we need to know how to use the speaker, but it's important we then do use it in that way. Your calculations of what the first reflections are, what the sound power is, completely change if you point this speaker straight and you've tucked it into the corner of the room and suddenly now at 10 degrees off axis, 20 degrees off axis, it's hitting a sidewall.
Mm-hmm.
But even worse, your main seat, let's have a quick look at where it actually lands. Yeah, your main seat's more than 30 degrees off axis to that speaker. So if you're really focused on the direct sound and you put that speaker here, the highlighted one, it doesn't reach, like, the listening window doesn't reach to the main seat.
Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, once you get this data, it should make it abundantly clear to anybody why they need to point speakers in the right place.
Well, here's another great example, and this correlates to a question that Derek actually has. So Derek asks, the Ascendo, the 12 Pro BE have an interesting Spinorama. I have heard them and really liked them. Would love to hear you all discuss going from the Spinorama and deciding speaker placement for the speaker. So this is a perfect example of what we're talking about with placement. If we look at the, where is it? At the CEA 2034, the on-axis sound for this does not look great. You can see all of this hibby-jibby up here. And this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, this is consistent behavior for coaxials.
Yeah, not all coaxials behave quite as wild as that looks.
No, but they will have something like this.
Correct.
And this is because of the interaction with how the speaker is designed and set up, the tweeter being in the middle, and then you have the woofer as the waveguide. It's important.
Yeah, its waveguide is a cone. You know, it's not a perfect waveguide because it's a speaker cone.
So when we look at this, the direct axis, and this was my example for the Black Swan. The Black Swan's a horn, but it kind of goes with this. You don't want to sit on axis to this speaker, ideally. You want to sit off axis. So if we go down, well, here, if you look at something like, is that the listening window right here, the green line? Yep. So the listening window is flat. And if you think about the windows that Ben had on his previous examples, so I can't, if we go back and do this one, right here, the listening windows, the yellow or orange areas, this would fall inside of that listening window. It's hard to see, you kind of got to zoom in, but the green line is much flatter. And then if we come down and look at the early reflections, total reflection, green, much flatter. And then if we come down and look at the actual horizontal frequency response, which is, we actually looked at this at another speaker, the center channel, and you were looking at response at different angles, you can see on-axis response, not great, which is expected because of the design choice that was made for this speaker. And that design choice was made in order to reach certain ends, right? Huge amounts of SPL, consistency, and we'll look at dispersion here in just a second. We will visit these in other windows or other videos, but consistency for vertical and horizontal dispersion. But if you look at your like 20 degrees off axis, which is this line, it flattens out and is actually pretty consistent
Yeah.
in there. So the recommendation for using a coaxial is to be somewhere between 10 to 20 degrees off axis, and you will get a much better response. But you have to do that because of the design compromise that was made in order to allow the speaker to do other things consistently, like dispersion. The dispersion vertically and horizontally is very consistent, and it allows for other design consistencies to be made in the room.
Yeah, it's quite important. One of the trade-offs that a coaxial gets is that it's time coherent for every listener. So because the tweeter is acoustically centered to where the woofer is,
Mhm.
the arrival time doesn't change. If you are in the front row, the back row, if you're slightly left or right, your distance, actual measured distance to the tweeter and the woofer is the same for every person in every seat.
Yep.
As you look at different speaker designs, that won't be the case.
Nope.
So a coaxial gives the same time response to all the seats because that's fundamental to its design. That's one of the benefits. So you do that and you accept that the on-axis performance will be compromised. But what also happened in a speaker like the Pro 12 is the reflections are really predictable. They follow the same shape, just getting quieter as they tail off, because the speaker gets more directional as frequencies go up. But it's really easy to predict what it's going to do in the room. So when we work with a speaker like that in our designs, prediction of how it's going to sound, how it's going to behave are quite simple. We don't put anyone directly on axis. And we know that even where that's not flat, so like if you take a Pro 12, the listening window's not perfectly flat.
No.
But the reflections all track it to the same degree.
And I
so
think
anything I fix in EQ, sorry?
Anything you fix in EQ tracks correctly.
Correct.
Linearly.
Right. So if I fix something in EQ, I adjust the EQ to get the on-axis response, not on-axis, the listening window response I want. I know that everything I've done to my reflections will be beneficial.
And I think
it's
that's
going to
really
keep tonality.
That's hugely important because if you hyper focus on direct sound, on-axis sound, you won't know that.
Right.
And I would actually say a speaker that deviates a little bit, it's not perfectly flat in the on-axis sound, but has consistency in its reflections and off-axis sound power is much more desirable than a speaker that is flat across the direct sound.
Right.
But doesn't track consistently because you can't treat that in the room. You can't EQ any of that. You can't, and of course, as long as it's within parameters, like it can't be extreme. You don't want it to be extreme. But if it's within a few dB, like remember the graphs we're looking at, they're scaled 5 dB. So every solid line, darker line, bold line is 5 dB, and then every small line is 1 dB. A lot of times you're going to see frequency responses that are way zoomed out, and you may have scales of 10 dB or 15 dB. So I'm not saying specifically for the Ascendo. I'm just saying we're pretty zoomed in. I actually like things to be much more zoomed in than that. When we were doing the Mad VR Experience Center, we were zoomed in at 2 dB intervals to really look at what the speakers were doing because we were chasing minutia in those examples. So to reiterate, consistency in my eyes is much more important than a laser flat response.
Yeah. 100%. Absolutely. So there have been a couple of questions around. Now I've actually got the chat window open and can see them. Apologies. How, like, about different speakers, how this data's given. So this is interesting, but part of this RP1 I spoke about at the start, this is core. We are requesting manufacturers give us this data. I don't know how many manufacturers will make the level of data we're asking for available to professionals behind a closed system. You have to log into your dealer account to get it, and how many will make it public. We are early days in this is the document, this is what we want, let's have it, right? So I would love this data to be available widely to consumers. At the moment, we have a bit of a mix. We have people like Ascendo who you just pulled one up. They publish this completely freely. Everything, all of their test data is right there. There are other brands who publish the overall results. They may do it in a different format. They may give a heat map or a polar plot, and they've got all the data. If you ask the right people, as professionals, you and I will have those contacts. We can go and ask for it, and we're going to receive it. Hopefully that is easier to standardize and we get it, more of it in the public domain. More of this data is available third party. You've got Erin and Amir and probably some others who are measuring it and publishing it. And that's great.
That's great with subs a lot of times. I mean, there's some guys out there that do help the industry in tremendous ways.
Right. So here's the bit that does get slightly controversial. And hey, I stand and say this regularly in front of classes when I'm teaching for CEA. This is the bit that is an opinion. This isn't, I mean, it's a fact, but not all manufacturers are going to like what I say next. But I will not spend my client's money with a manufacturer that doesn't give me this data. That's just that's a red line. If I can't get the data, if I can't get it in private, it doesn't bother me because I can get it from other places, whether it's public. Of course, for enthusiasts, I'd love it to see that. But if I can't get it full stop, I'm not spending my client's money on it. That's just a fact. So I think we should be asking for it. And I think this is a really key thing is in pro audio, this has been standard. You understand what products in pro audio do. It's just a requirement. In consumer audio, we've had this data for so long. We've had Floyd's research and all the rest of the Harman research from Sean, from Todd. Residential manufacturers aren't publishing it because they don't have to, because people keep buying the products by walking into a hi-fi dem, listening to it in that room. I like this one over that one. That doesn't tell you what it will do when you get it home. You don't know what it will do in your room.
No.
You don't know what it will do so you don't know at your listening distance in your room with your reflections what that speaker's going to do. You just know it sounded good in that hi-fi store at that point. So we can influence it. We can ask our manufacturers to provide it, and we can shop with our wallets. It's really quite simple that the manufacturers whoever made that speaker, I know who it was, but that speaker we were looking at, they've chosen to make a speaker that's going to have a high likelihood of being perceived good by a lot of population. They've made that choice. They've not gone out on a wing and a prayer, thrown stuff in a box and said, oh, I like how it sounds. They've intentionally crafted something which has a high likelihood of sounding good when you put it in your room. And we can see that in the data. So as those kind of those kind of manufacturers see their sales going up, and the hit and hope kind of manufacturers see sales struggle potentially over time, I think we can get to a world where we start to see people designing speakers in a way that make them predictable, make them likely to behave well.
And the funny thing about that is we as people, we use tools, right? That's a big part of what sets us apart in the animal kingdom. But for some reason, we view things like speakers not as tools. And if you tried to buy a tool, if you went into Home Depot and you didn't have an expectation to how it was going to behave, like if you're trying to buy a different saw, the expectation is that that saw is going to behave in X way to be able to allow you to accommodate X job. If I bought a saw and I had no idea how it was going to cut, and it was just a black box, and somehow I was going to get like a compound miter box, or it was going to be a jigsaw, or it was going to be a sawzall, or it was going to be a fine saw, or it was going to be a skill saw, I'd have no idea. And if I don't know, how can I accomplish that job? It's like hitting, or a hammer, right? I have no idea what the product is, but I'm going to try and use every product like it's a hammer. That doesn't make sense. And the same thing applies to speakers. You cannot just blindly buy something, and we should not take this approach where you blindly buy something to try and accomplish X job. But for some
Right.
reason, consumers don't want to look at speakers as tools when they absolutely are. You need it
Yeah.
to accomplish X job. And in order to do that, you need to understand how it's behaving to know that it can even do what you're asking it to do.
100%.
And the way we know how that works is through measurement data. And so I encourage all of you guys that are watching, and I think people are starting to do this. Ask for measurement data. Put pressure on it because the manufacturers may not provide this data now. But if they get enough pressure from the consumer, they very well might in the future. And that's
Right.
what we're after. We're after consistency. We're after the details. Because if I go and buy a pro speaker, let's say I'm a pro that's trying to design an audio system for a stadium or a concert venue, and I go and I ask JBL, or I go ask L Acoustics, or I go ask, I don't know, upteen other ones on, hey, how do your speakers behave? I'm going to get handed a book on
Yeah.
how this speaker behaves, what it does, what its
Yeah.
limitations are, how it interacts with the amplifier, what the DSP is, all of this stuff. So, proper positioning, all of this, so I get an expected result. You go do that same thing for a consumer product, all you're going to get in the majority of cases, and there are some outliers, and I applaud those companies that are the outliers. All you're going to get in the majority of those cases is you're going to get pointed to the website and you're going to say, our specs are here. And you can't even, when you go look at those specs, like I talked about with the frequency response, you cannot even make correct judgments without
Yeah.
correlating against the remaining data. Right? So
Right.
like if I look at a maximum SPL for a speaker and all it says is 110 dB, how do I know where that is? You have
Right.
no idea what that even means because it
No.
actually typically means at X frequency, who knows what that is. So you cannot expect that it's going to be. I'm actually going to show you an example real quick. Let me
You've got no idea how much crest factor the test signal had. If it
know.
just says, so you don't know anything. But this becomes interesting
We'll get off this high horse here in just a second.
when you say about like a stadium. If you're designing a stadium, you get one chance. You put your tender in, you get paid vast amounts of money. You have X number of days to fit that kit, and it damn well better work the day they open. There is no going back. There's no second chance. You've got one chance.
So
With
here's
a hi-fi 2-channel, that, subjectivity is easier because you can go to a hi-fi store, borrow a pair of speakers, take them home. Do I like them? Not for me. Go back to the hi-fi store, borrow something else. Like, it's 2 speakers. It's quite easy to throw 2 speakers into a room 4 or 5 times if you live near a good hi-fi store.
So I'm just going to
But
say
with,
that, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, with a home theater, that's not going to happen. You're designing a room in advance. You're choosing where you're going to put them. If you're using an in-wall or an on-wall product, you're having to get the cables to it. You're physically positioning that speaker before you've heard what it's going to do in that room. So we have to be able to make predictions of what we will like, what our clients will like, because the first time anyone's going to hear it is when it's finished.
Yep. I agree.
That's what happens in pro audio. That's different from hi-fi, and that's why this is so important to us, is because we're making judgment decisions we can't test.
Here's a perfect example of what can happen with that maximum SPL. This is a Ascendo Pro or 12 Pro BE. Okay. This is actually how a lot of speakers are going to raw without EQ, what they're going to do with compression, right? So this is a CEA 2010B, and this is showing compression information for maximum output at a given voltage and where you're running, what the maximum is until you run into X distortion. Where do I say on this graph what the maximum SPL of that speaker is? Let's say I say it's at 200 hertz, That's 135 roughly dB. So if I tell somebody in a spec sheet, the average consumer, that this speaker's maximum output is 135 dB, the majority of people are going to think that that's across the entire frequency range. And that is not true. Because if I go down to, let's say, the crossover point, I'm now down 20 dB. And that's significant. So this is important to take into consideration because you can get yourself into trouble. Frankly, you can even damage speakers by pushing things to those limits. Because this is a problem because there's no correlation on what that information means. So this is what we're talking about with RP1 and making sure that there is consistency and that there is cooperation for what that data represents.
Yeah, we will need to cover SPL
We will.
for a time. So in RP1, there are multiple ways it can be reported. The Spinorama comes from CEA 2034. RP1 uses the same SPL measurements that are in 2034. Part of 2034 has SPL measurements. It has a continuous and a peak. Those are both options to give in RP1. There are more. So there's a really long-term test from AES2, which I think is 8 hours. So it has to be able to play that test tone to that level without showing thermal degradation for 8 hours. Then the continuous test, what we would call a continuous test, which is likely what is on a spec sheet for a product, is a 2 or 3 minute. I think it's a 2-minute test. You edge up 1 dB at a time, leave it for 2 minutes, see if thermal compression kicks in. Then we've got a peak rating, which is done differently again. Then there's another set of ways to do this, which is from AES 75. Their continuous test is very similar to a 2034. They come out for almost all speakers. They'll come out within 1 or 2 dB of each other. They're continuous ratings. Their peak ratings can easily be 5, 6, 7 dB different. So what you're reporting on a spec sheet could be 5 or 6 dB different, depending on which one of those standardized tests you did. Well, I just need to know, is this peak 124 dB using AES 75's peak measurement, or is it 124 dB using CEA 2034's peak measurement? Because they're different. So we will focus on all of those tests because there's a lot of reason why there are different tests. It comes back down to why do speakers fail. There's a whole, it's 2 hours on its own right there.
Yep. All right. Well, we got off on a little tangent, and we're actually probably going to get off on that tangent every time we have one of these episodes because I think it's really important in closing that people understand why all of this is important. And I think it's all just as important as being able to read these measurements. Because if you can read the measurements, you can better understand how a speaker behaves and you can better implement it into your room. And we need that data to use a tool properly. So next episode, we're probably just going to frankly go down the Spinorama information. We did CEA 2034. You want to talk about dispersion next?
Yeah, we'll talk about some more elements of it. We'll confirm that offline. We'll do next.
All right. Ignore what I just said.
And we'll wrap it up before I've seen, now I've got the chat open. I can see Tom Delly, what a good friend of ours, throwing comments in now. So we're going to have to wrap up before Tom starts to. Tom's probably getting giddy and going to do something silly like send one of us a naked photo to make us laugh while we're online, because that's the kind of thing Tom does.
As long as it's taken in an anechoic chamber, that's all that matters.
Yeah, he's probably sat on a barco naked somewhere because we know how Tom rolls. He's going to text me any second.
Yeah, that would be Tom. All right.
We did have a question from Derek. I will just answer while it's there. Is HAA the primary best way to study this type of stuff? So there's 3 levels of a current HAA course, and I've spent some time with others, with Adam Pels and Jerry LeMay, talking about what else they may add. Levels 1, 2, and 3. 1 is kind of a home study. It's quite theoretical. 2 and 3, in person, in a lab type environment. Basically, those courses, if you do 2 and 3 over 4 days, it will really open your eyes to how these reflections behave, how subwoofers behave in a room, how room modes behave. So it's very hands-on to actually experience it and fix it in real time.
I mean, an easy way to
I
do
was just
this,
checking.
to experience things, is to take a speaker and just change how it's angled against a wall, and sit back in a
Right.
listening position and listen to how it changes. If you just wanna, on a very less than scientific approach, that'll give you an understanding of what we're talking about with how important reflections
Yeah.
are, and how
So the benefit.
also listen to how, if you have 2 speakers, how putting or changing those angles can drastically affect your soundstage, right? This is HAA is going to give you a better understanding of how, and then how to manage those and how to fix and the why. But if you don't have the time or necessarily want to go, experiment, play,
Yeah.
learn so much through play. It is so important just to test this stuff, and it will give you a huge understanding. Even if you don't understand the scientific why, but you can reproduce it, it's valuable.
Yeah. The benefit of doing it there is you switch off from everything else for a few days, and you have speakers and subs and absorbers and diffusers. You've got kit to play with. The value is in the playing. So the benefit they bring is that they just have a whole load of stuff
Mhm.
ready for you to play with and what to listen to as you change things. So I think it's really useful. It's not low cost, let's be honest. And they're across the world, whether it's in your city, you've got travel costs. You can replicate the same things at home, but it's definitely fun to hang out with a group of 7 or 8 friends and do it in that structure. So I like it. It's not the only way to learn some of it. If you're in the industry, then we teach a lot at ISE, CEA Expo, at different CEA events. There's always quite a lot of teaching and lectures on. So yeah, I guess can consumers go to those? Not sure, probably not. But there's
in CEA, there's ways in.
sorry.
To ISE and CEDIA, there's ways in. The shows
Yeah, I'm just
or to
thinking
the
whether there is
classes,
particularly
probably
for
not.
the lectures, but you
No.
can pay to attend them. Yeah.
No, I
So
guess
yeah, there are options, but it's as much as anything, as I've said, like we're talking about what these things do, the effects they'll have. Go and play. Go and try it.
go and play. That's how we learn. But we'll wrap this up. We will be back at the very latest next Monday to talk more about measurements. I'm not sure what part of the measurements I said dispersion, and Ben went, no. So we'll see where we end up. But enjoy those home theater journeys. If you guys have any need for design help, reach out to Ben at Cinema Bureau. His contact information is in the description. If you guys have any questions or need any gear pricing, specifically if you're in the States, Ben is worldwide. If you're in the States, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the description. Anyway, enjoy those home theater journeys. Stay safe out there, and we will see you guys in the next episode. Have a good one.
Have a good one, all. Cheers.